Hocam başlayabiliriz isterseniz. Buyurun.
Evet, iyi akşamlar herkese. Türk Radyasyon Onkolojisi Derneği'nin düzenlediği radyobiyoloji, temel klinik radyobiyoloji kursuna hoş geldiniz. 9. haftasını düzenliyoruz. Bundan sonraki konuşmamızı İngilizce olarak devam ediyorum. Uluslararası oldukça tanınmış, bu konuda yıllarını vermiş bir hocamız bize lecturer olarak, konuşmacı olarak katkıda bulunacak. Okay, so welcome to the Turkish Radiation Oncology Society Radiobiology course. This is the 9th week, and we have a very distinguished speaker, lecturer for us. We are really very happy to have him with us. Without too much words, I will just move to the program. We have 2 talks today, and the first one will be given by Professor Soren Benson. He is now in the US, and he is going to talk us about the QUANTEC, the current concept and the future. And after his talk, I will give a talk about the clinical evaluation and the quantification of radiation injury. I just want to shortly give you some introduction about Professor Benson for those who are young and don't know him very well, but otherwise we know him very well. He has visited one of our national meetings before, and we had the chance to meet with him, and we had the chance to listen from him all the works, the interesting works and the current works he has been working on. Soren Benson is now working in the University of Maryland in the radiation oncology department and epidemiology and the public health departments. He's the director of many other departments also. He's working in collaboration in many different countries, not only his university, but he's only the country that he's working, but many different countries. He has this education in Denmark in physics and mathematics, and he worked in several different countries, starting from Copenhagen, Aarhus, Copenhagen, then MD Anderson in the US, and back in Danish Cancer Society, Gray Laboratory in London, in University of Wisconsin, across the Atlantic, and now he's in the University of Maryland. He has received several medals from different organizations, including the ASTRO and the ASTRO, and he has received the Fellow of ASTRO in 2018. And he has done a lot of work in the side effects of the radiation treatment, and he is one of the leaders of the QUANTEC initiative. And he is also now working in the BENTZEN as in the steering committee for the pediatric population. And he is participating in several trials. But also what I would recommend to our young colleagues to follow him in the Twitter, because he's quite active user, and he is doing a lot of comments in the current literatures that you are also following. So with this, I would just stop and give the words to him.
Thank you very
Benson,
much.
Please.
Thank you very much. That was a great introduction. I obviously enjoyed everything you said. That was very kind. So thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to give this lecture today. It's a great pleasure to be invited to your program in radiation biology. It's obviously a topic very close to my heart, and I'm very happy that you asked me to talk about QUANTEC. I'll give you a very brief introduction to what QUANTEC did and what it was, and I'll try to take that into where we are today. I'll also have to apologize. I didn't realize that Professor Benson would have a lecture after this one. I would have loved to attend that as well, but I do need to get off the call for a conflicting meeting. But I can hopefully take a few questions after the talk. So QUANTEC, the QUANTEC papers were published 12 years ago in the March issue of the Red Journal in 2010. And what it was basically a collection of 24 papers. I did check on PubMed that in the first 10 years after the publication, they had together been cited 5,700 times. So in that sense, it was a very influential collaboration. It was a volunteer network, QUANTEC. It consisted of a group of medical physicists and statisticians and clinicians, radiation oncologists, who had decided to try to give a comprehensive overview of the literature on normal tissue complication modeling at that point in time. So in the QUANTEC issue, you will find 16 papers on normal organ tolerance, using dose volume metrics and trying to devise the best possible at that time tools for how to estimate constraints or how to decide what is a safe dose to a given organ at risk. It became quite influential also in the US. For a while, it was used by a lot of insurance companies. If you could get below the QUANTEC constraints delivering standard radiation therapy, the insurance company would pay for that. If you needed IMRT to meet the constraint, they would pay for IMRT. So in a way, QUANTEC had even more influence than we thought it would have when we worked on it. Now, QUANTEC came out of the evolution in radiotherapy planning and delivering technologies. It came during the period where the field had moved from 2D radiotherapy to 3D and later to IMRT and later again into potentially light ion beam therapy. And because of the change in how we planned and delivered radiation therapy, there was suddenly a need to be able to compare those plans with respect to the effects on normal tissues. The fact that we now delivered a lot of dose, but at a lower level of dose to many normal tissues around the target volume meant that we had to compare that kind of dose distribution with the more simple, often parallel opposing field techniques that we had been using historically. So if we put all of this on a timeline, the Amami paper was published in 1991, and that was essentially a collection of tolerance doses or constraints, if you liked. If you gave a given dose to a third of an organ, 2/3 of an organ, or the whole organ. And it was not entirely data-based. It was not based on empirical data to a large extent. It was more like a consensus among experts at the time who tried to come up with what reasonable dose constraints would be in these kind of settings. But the kind of scenario where you irradiate a third of an organ to a fairly uniform dose or 2/3 of an organ to a fairly uniform dose, that's more like a traditional 3D dose plan, 3D conformal radiotherapy dose plan. With IMRT, we have often many fields, or we deliver part of the treatment using rotational delivery, and that creates this much more varied dose distribution throughout the normal tissues around the target volume. So the first patient was treated with IMRT at Baylor College of Medicine in 1994. A couple of years later, the first patient was treated with dynamic multi-lead collimators at Memorial Sloan Kettering. That happened in 1996. And in the early 2000s, we had a wide adoption of IMRT in departments throughout the world, not just in the US, but also in Europe and in many other continents throughout. And QUANTEC came sort of in the middle of all this. It was initiated back in 2006, 2007. A group of people got together and decided that it would be helpful to produce this kind of an overview. And the papers that came out of this effort were published in March 2010, as we just discussed. So you would see that the total time from the beginning to the publication of this set of papers was in the order of 3 years. When we started working on QUANTEC, we discussed whether we should also include hypofractionated regimens, SBRT-style regimens, where you had very high conformality and where you delivered a few very large fractions to often quite contained target volume. We decided that that was an emerging field at the time and that there wasn't a lot of literature available. So it was decided to postpone that kind of an overview. And we also decided that we would only review the adult radiation oncology literature. We deliberately chose to not include pediatric radiation oncology data. So fairly soon after the publication of the QUANTEC volume, the HITEC collaboration was formed. And HITEC was about hyperfractionated or high dose per fraction radiation therapy. So that was a review of the SBRT style technologies or deliveries and the constraints that you would use for that kind of treatment. And that had a much longer gestation period than QUANTEC had. We thought QUANTEC was slow, but HITEC turned out to take nearly 10 years from the beginning to the publication of the papers. And then pretty much in parallel with the HITEC effort, we started working on the BENTZEN collaboration. I was one of the founding members also of that collaboration. And the purpose of BENTZEN was to review the childhood cancer survivorship and the dose constraints for irradiating children with ionizing radiation. The HITEC effort was published last year in May, also in the Red Journal. And again, these papers are free. You can download them. They are not behind the paywall. I won't cover HITEC in great detail today, partly because of the time constraint, partly also because I think HITEC was sort of overtaken by reality, if you know what I mean. Because during the period where the HITEC reviews were ongoing, there was so much new data coming on board. And I think to some extent, without being unfair to the group behind HITEC, but I think to some extent that has made the HITEC less relevant today, even though it was published relatively recently. Also, BENTZEN is close to a conclusion, but we have tried to make the organ-specific papers, the reviews, as current as possible. So I hope we are less subject to this aging effect of the literature. There's a couple of papers that are out already. One was published in Clinical Oncology in 2019, and that describes a lot of the methodology that we decided to use. And then just last year, late in 21, we published what is essentially the preface to what will become the BENTZEN volume of the Red Journal. So again, these papers are available for you to download if you're interested. But I'll go into the BENTZEN effort a little bit later in the talk today. Now, if we look at what happened on the modeling side, that has been fairly dramatic as well. Of course, it all began in the modern era with the linear quadratic model. It had a single parameter, maybe 2-3 parameters, depending on what flavor of the linear quadratic model we were looking at. And sometimes it didn't even have a single free parameter because people often assumed values for the alpha-beta ratio. The standard textbook values of 10 gray for tumors and 3 gray for late effects and so on essentially meant that it was a model without free parameters. So the LQ model was widely adopted. It was first proposed back in the 40s. It got a renaissance in the 1980s, and it was widely adopted in the 1990s, and is still in use for adjusting for dose per fraction. NTCP modeling started with the advent of 3D conformal techniques, and that was the dominating kind of modeling back when the QUANTEC overview was produced. And what has happened since then is that the field has gone into a more statistical kind of modeling. Most of the papers that are being published today are statistical regression models, logistic regression, or maybe Cox proportional hazards for the late effects, or maybe some parametric latent time distribution like mixture models and so on have been used. Often the number of parameters have gone up. In addition to the standard dose per fraction and volume effects, we also try now to model the effect of patient level risk factors such as comorbidity or co-medications. We try to model the effect of combined modalities, whether it's cytotoxic drugs or molecular targeted agents or immuno-oncology agents. And the sample sizes that we are analyzing are typically much larger than what was available back in the QUANTEC days. A typical series in the QUANTEC overview would have like 70, 80, 100 cases maybe, and were often single institutional case series. Now we have access to much larger data sets. In part thanks to archival systems, so we can go back and reconstruct those distributions in large numbers of patients going several years back in time, but in part also from cooperative group or large public registry data that has really pushed the number of cases into the many thousands now. So it's a much better basis for doing these kind of estimation procedures. And just around the corner, we have all the exciting developments with artificial intelligence and machine learning. And again, I'll address that a little bit if we have time towards the end of the lecture. It's very exciting. And at this point in time, it's probably a good idea just to take stock of where we are and what we can reasonably expect to see in the next 5 years or so. A lot of the historical modeling was not very statistical. A lot of it was driven by medical physicists back in the days. And that also changed after 2010. People started to use state-of-the-art statistical methodology, the kind of efforts that were put into validating models and calibrating them and showing that they could actually work if you applied them in an independent series from the one they had been developed in. All of that really came online in the last 10 years or so. And unfortunately, in this context, the AI ML type of methods are lagging a bit behind because a lot of those papers actually lack appropriate statistical evaluation of what those kind of models can do. So if we look at the big picture, we have gone from the LQ model that was at least initially a mechanistic model going into more statistical type modeling, and now moving into the era of neural networks. And also the use of these models have changed. The LQ model was originally mainly used to compare fractionation schedules. And the NTCP models were used often to derive population constraints. So what is a safe dose for the lung parenchyma, or what is a safe dose for the eye, or what is a safe dose for the brainstem, say, or to do class solution comparisons. For instance, comparing a IMRT type delivery technique with a standard 3D conformal technique. But what has happened in the recent years is that we have now moved more towards not comparing class solutions, but comparing outcome in individual patients. And that again has dramatically changed the scene. It has dramatically changed how we think about models, and it has made the models much more critical in terms of the accuracy when you actually use it to prescribe treatment in an individual patient. Now let me tell you a little bit about BENTZEN also, and I'll return to the AI and ML towards the end. But let me just tell you a little bit about BENTZEN, because BENTZEN in a way is the collision between two frameworks for studying late treatment effects after radiation therapy. What we did in the QUANTEC era was that we looked at what we could call traditional NCCP models. And we often had a relatively homogeneous population that was exposed. You would often take a series of breast cancer patients or a series of bladder cancer patients, and then you would study adverse events as a function of time in that population. The exposure was known in these series. We had relatively accurate estimates of those to the relevant organs at risk or to the relevant structures if it was a substructure in an organ. And that came out of the CT-based treatment plans, of course. And then we often use specific clinical biological endpoints. I'm sure Professor Abasioglu will tell you a lot about the difficulties involved in doing this. So when I'm saying that we often use specific endpoints, even that is not so simple. We have learned a lot also in that respect. But often the endpoints were actually specific to radiation exposure. And we were often forced to look at relatively low-grade events, say grade 2 pneumonitis, simply because the events were so relatively rare that in order to have sufficient numbers of cases to look at, we needed to go to relatively low-grade toxicity. And then we used relatively simple mathematical dose-response functions, often characterized just by two parameters, a position parameter and a steepness parameter. And then, of course, you needed some kind of a volume parameter, for instance, the Lyman model, if you included the effect of dose distribution into the model. And this whole framework is so different from what we had in the pediatric literature. So one of the first challenges in BENTZEN was to meet what we used to do with what had happened already in the childhood cancer survivor population. The populations reported are often heterogeneous in terms of the age at exposure, the underlying diagnosis, and the population exposed, and the techniques used will often span over a very long period of time. And this means that the technologies applied in the early years may not be comparable to what we apply today. The exposure in many of these studies is relatively poorly described. Often we have tried to get a guesstimate of the dose using retrospective phantom dosimetry, and thereby trying to make a dose estimate, but it's obviously not nearly as rigid as what you could get if you had individual CT scans. And then what is important is that the endpoints are often not specific to radiation exposure. A lot of the adverse events after radiation therapy for childhood cancer are events that could also happen in unirradiated individuals. Say congestive heart disease or valvular disease of the heart, or say second malignancies, or some kind of growth disturbance from hormonal growth hormone effects of radiation therapy. These are effects of radiation that modulate the risk of something happening, but they are actually not specific to the fact that these children have been irradiated with ionizing radiation. And this means that instead of calculating the probability of something happening as a function of dose, like what we used to do with our NCCP models, now we are talking a different kind of language. We are often talking about the excess relative risk, or we are talking about the excess absolute risk. It means that when we compare irradiated individuals with a group of unirradiated controls, what is then the relative change in the risk, or what is the absolute additional risk that can be attributed to the radiation therapy? Now, I won't take you through all the definitions. Again, I think it's not really a good use of our time today, but I just wanted to show you a table of the many different measures that you will find in the literature. And as part of the BENTZEN papers, we will discuss these in slightly more detail. So if you are a little patient, hopefully within the next 1 year or so, these papers will be out in the Rate Journal, and then we will discuss how you can convert from one risk estimate to the other. But what I would like to tell you today, and I'm sure a lot of you are aware of this already, but just highlighting how important it is to keep them separate. You can typically convert from one way of quantifying risk to another, but you need to be really careful with your language, that you really make sure what it is that you are calculating, and you need to be really careful with how you interpret the risk, because obviously it will make a big difference whether it's an absolute risk or a relative risk that we are calculating. Now, this all became acutely important because of Sarah Darby's paper on major coronary events after radiation therapy as post-operative treatment for breast cancer. And Sarah Darby published a big case control study. This was in adults, but the problems are the same, of course. And she derived this relationship. She plotted the percent increase in the major coronary event rate with 95% confidence intervals as a function of the mean heart dose. And then she could show that there was a dose response, and she could calculate the increase in risk per gray. And you may remember this number. It has become almost a famous number in radiation therapy, the 7.4% increase in risk per gray. But that, of course, is the excess relative risk. So the relative risk estimate, of course, looks more impressive than the absolute risk estimates. But it may also give a wrong impression of how dangerous the treatment is. And I think, again, when you inform patients, or if you make decisions as to, say, compare two treatment plans, it's obviously very important not just to think about the relative risk, but also to consider the excess absolute risk that results from treatment. And let me just show you how that works. So these are some calculations that I did based on the modeling that's in the Sarah Darby's paper. Here on the x-axis, we have the mean heart dose in gray. And here we have the absolute risk of ischemic heart disease after radiotherapy if you are treated when you're younger than 60 and if you live until you are 80. So it's the risk you will have experienced by the time you reach 80, given that you were treated when you were younger than 60. And you can see the absolute risk in patients who have no cardiac risk factors is very small. The absolute risk is very small. And even in patients who have one or more cardiovascular disease risk factors, such as hypertension, smoking, whatever it may be, these risk factors are associated with an elevated risk of ischemic heart disease also after radiation therapy. But again, you can see this curve hardly gets much above the x-axis. And in fact, you would need a magnifying glass to really see the difference. The risk if the mean heart dose is 10 gray for this kind of a scenario is 1.2%. And if you have one risk factor, one or more risk factor, I should say, that risk will increase to 2.2%. So it's still a relatively low risk. And as I'm sure you are aware, in most cases with modern techniques, we are well below 10 gray. That would be a very high mean heart dose with modern radiotherapy. So again, I'm not dismissing the value of looking at relative risks. They are helpful in many ways, but it's also important to be able to go back and forth, to go from what looks like a high increase in the relative risk to realizing that that actually corresponds to a relatively small increment in the absolute risk of something happening. The other thing to be aware of is that because the risk at a given point in time will depend both on your age when you are exposed and the age after the follow-up period that you are considering. So it's both a question of the age at exposure and the attained age at the time when you estimate the effect of treatment. And let me just show you how this works. So these are women who are having post-operative radiotherapy after breast surgery. And this is the excess absolute risk of coronary events in a woman who was 40 when she was treated, 50, 60, and 70. And this is the excess absolute risk at 10 years of follow-up. So you can see for a 40-year-old, the risk after 10 years is much lower. Look at the units on the y-axis. This is a 1% risk. So the risk of having a coronary event, even after a fairly high mean heart dose in a 40-year-old, is very, very low. And it's relatively higher with increasing age, and it will be highest in this scenario if you are treated when you're 70 years old. So this is one way to think about the age at exposure effect. The other way, of course, is to say, yes, but hopefully a 40-year-old with a breast cancer will be cured for her breast cancer. And why not? She may go on and live until she's 80 years old. And then, of course, the age effect sort of turns around, because a 40-year-old will be exposed to the potential risks of having radiation therapy for a much larger part of her life than a 70-year-old. So you see how it's now upside down. We would say that a 40-year-old who is irradiated has a higher lifetime risk if she lives until she's 80 than a 50-year-old, higher than a 60-year-old, and higher than a 70-year-old. So you see how getting to the bottom of this, say you are informing a patient about what kind of risks she will be exposed to by having radiation therapy after breast cancer surgery. And you will have to be very careful how you present this in a young patient versus an old patient. For a 40-year-old, a 10-year time horizon may not be super relevant. For a 70-year-old, without being too cynical about it, a 10-year horizon is maybe a fairly good horizon to be discussing. So again, it's a dynamic risk, and you have to be able to tell your patient about that as well. Now, let me just show you how we have now moved into trying to estimate these risks at the individual patient level. And this was just an article about biomathematics in one of the UK newspapers in 2019. This lady is a biomathematician, and she said that in a way, also mathematicians and technology specialists should take the Hippocratic Oath. The point being that if we do algorithmic medicine, if you use a deep learning neural network to prescribe treatment or to select patients for a given treatment, then that network in a way becomes part of the prescription, doesn't it? You may still have a medical doctor interpreting the output and informing the patient, but the algorithm itself becomes part of the chain of treatment prescription. So a lot of the quality control and a lot of the responsibility for checking algorithms and so on will lie with the mathematicians, and for good reasons. It will not typically lie with the medical doctors. They will still use their medical knowledge, of course, whether this is a reasonable prescription and or not, and that's still their responsibility. But of course, you cannot expect a medical doctor to go down and look whether a neural network is appropriately trained or not. Now, the two uses of these kind of estimates now. One is for selecting patients for proton therapy instead of photon therapy. This is often referred to as the Dutch model. It was a methodology promoted by Professor Langendijk in Groningen in the Netherlands. And that group has published a lot of very, very good modeling papers. I won't go through all the details of what they do, but in effect, what they do is that they do a plan comparison. They use models to estimate the normal tissue effects of a proton plan compared to a photon plan. And then they refer patients to proton therapy if the expected benefit from protons is sufficiently large. And that has been accepted in the Netherlands by the insurance companies as the basis for reimbursing proton therapy. But now the quality of the model becomes really important, and important in a different way than what we saw back in the QUANTEC time, where we used it more to say, yes, what would an IMRT versus a 3D conformal plan do in a patient? Now you really would have to believe the model, at least to some extent believe the model. And the problem, of course, is that if you train a model on one radiation delivery technique, it may not easily be valid for another technique. This again was work done by also Hans Langendijk's group, looking at predicted risk versus observed risk. And they did that in a 3D conformal radiotherapy cohort. And they looked at sticky saliva and expression of dryness of the mouth. And what they did was that they used an NTCP model, and then they had a validation set of 162 patients and say, okay, how well can the model actually predict what we observe in these patients? And you can see when the validation cohort was an IMRT cohort, actually the model didn't fit that well. So if you look at this is the predicted risk as you go from low risk to higher and higher risk, you can see that the observed risk actually doesn't vary a lot. Maybe with the exception of the very low risk, they did have a low risk, but all the slightly higher risk, basically the predicted risk has no relationship to the observed risk. So that's the challenge. When we say that a model is validated, it's only valid within a given frame. And that frame in this case is 3D conformal radiotherapy. And when you took that model and applied it in an IMRT population, then it didn't perform as well as it would have done before. And that, of course, is also the problem with photon versus proton comparisons. There are very few models that have been validated for proton therapy. Most of the models that we have currently are photon therapy models. And it's not obvious that you can use a photon therapy model and then use that model to predict the outcome of a proton therapy plan. I won't take you through this in great detail. This is work from our department. One of our residents, one of our doctors in training is the first author, Christina de Cesaris, and this is published in the Red Journal. But we actually saw that for skin reactions, we used the equivalent dose in 2 gray fractions to a rind just below the skin. Proton therapy for a given dose to that volume is actually a higher risk of having grade 2 or grade 3 dermatitis than a photon plan. So if we use the photon plan model to estimate the benefit from going to a proton plan, then we would in fact be too optimistic about what the protons would do. So you see, the point is that most likely when you do these kind of plan comparisons, you would actually need a photon model for the photon treatment and a proton model to evaluate the effect of the proton treatment. So that's a challenge currently. Now, let me just skip this other example in the interest of time. I just wanted to show you the other main application that we have been working on at University of Maryland. It is the idea that we can now start to factor individual patient level risk factors into our dose constraints. If we are willing to accept, in this case, a 20% risk of radiation pneumonitis, then we can use the QUANTEC dose-response relationship for pneumonitis. And what Anne Appelt and colleagues did in this paper that we collaborated on was to try to say, okay, what if that patient actually has risk factors for developing pneumonitis? Then the constraint would have to be dropped from 19.8 gray all the way down to 7 gray. And smoking is actually a protective factor, believe it or not, but that has been established in a lot of studies. And a smoker could actually have a higher constraint on the mean lung dose for the same risk of pneumonitis. And that can be taken all the way into your plan optimization. Again, this is work from our group at University of Maryland. It has also been published, so feel free to consult the paper if you're interested. But the idea is to try to optimize the plan, not using dose metrics for the optimization, but using patient outcome, using one of these models to predict the outcome from a given plan. And then instead of optimizing doses, we try to optimize the outcome in an individual patient. So this is the mean heart dose if you don't have a risk factor versus if you have a risk factor. If you have a risk factor, and you can see what happens in patients without risk factors, that's the mean heart dose on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, we have those same individuals, but now assuming that they had one or more risk factors for cardiovascular disease. And you can see that then the dose, the mean heart dose, will be pushed below the y equal x line. So we will have more dose to the heart without the risk factors than if the patient has the risk factor. So we can take more of a risk in a healthy patient, if you like, than we could in a patient who had cardiovascular risk factors. And why would we take more risk? We would obviously take more risk because these are individuals who had regional nodal irradiation after breast cancer, and you can push the dose to your target volume more in a healthy individual than you could in a patient with risk factors if you were willing to accept the same risk of cardiac complications. So that allows us now to move into a different way of treatment planning. And again, I won't take you through too much detail here in the interest of time, but you can basically work towards plans that for a given level of risk will give you the maximum possible tumor control probability. And such a plan is called Pareto optimal. The point being that if you're willing to accept more risk, you may be able to improve the tumor control, but for a given fixed level of risk, a Pareto optimal plan cannot be improved. It is optimal within that constraint. So we have done work like this, and again, showing here, depending on what modeling parameters we assume, we can protect the heart more or less. And it all depends, of course, not just on the cardiac tolerance that we estimate, but also on what we estimate in terms of underdosage to the target volume. You would need to optimize the trade-off between the dose to the target and the protection of the normal tissue. And again, we would be relying on the bioeffect models to strike that balance. So it's a very exciting perspective. It's obviously something that may happen in the future. We are not quite there yet in terms of having the reliable models that allow to start doing it in the clinic tomorrow. But at least in principle, we have shown that this could be achieved. So from forward planning to inverse planning, IMRT is inverse planning basically, and then we propose that the next generation of treatment planning will be outcome optimization in this multi-objective optimization. So you will define what endpoints you want to constrain, and you will discuss with your patient and taking lots of different aspects into consideration, the age of the patient willingness to accept risk, and so on and so forth. And all of that will then point to what an optimal plan would look like. And we can factor these models directly into the optimizer. So it's not a two-step procedure. It will be the way to optimize your fluence profiles directly. Now, in the last 5 minutes, I just wanted to say a few words about the data science era that we are going into currently. And I know it's a little bit brief, but I just thought I would cover that perspective as well. It's all about artificial intelligence. It's all about all the exciting developments. It comes in many, many flavors: automated learning, machine learning, natural language processing, computer vision, robotics, and so on and so forth. It's everywhere. If you have a phone in your pocket and you ask for photos of yourself or your wife or whatever, then again, with a little bit of luck, you will find lots of photos of yourself or whatever you wanted to find. If you ask for photos with water in them, it will be very, very good at finding all kinds of lakes and the sea and the rivers and so on and so forth on your phone. And that is done using this kind of algorithm. There are lots of processes in radiation oncology in the workflow that are completely suited for this kind of automation. So contouring, segmentation, planning, volume response estimation, staging, reading images, digital pathology, and of course, it also plays a role in the delivery in the treatment room. All of those processes can be automated. You will still need human observer intervention and auditing capabilities, but it will be tools that will considerably improve our efficiency in the future. And there's also an interest in using this for statistical inference. Instead of using statistical models, you can use these more complex neural networks for trying to establish, for instance, the pattern that links dose distributions to outcomes. Now, if we look at those two applications, the automation is obvious. I mean, this is already happening, and I have no doubt that this will be a big impact on how we practice radiation oncology. The inference part, I think, is much more, it's more up in the air. It's more controversial right now. I'm not sure that it will really replace statistical modeling. And I have a lot of good reasons for believing that, or for being skeptical, if you like. But obviously, it's something that we are working on, and it is something that we need to explore. We need to show to what extent these kind of models are really useful, or if they are not as useful as more hypothesis-driven modeling that we have been doing up to now. And then, of course, we are beginning to have really large data sets, and they come from all kinds of databases. They come from electronic health records. They come from public records of hospitalization or the National Death Index. They come from wearable devices, smartphones, payer records like insurance companies, or if you have public health care, from public administrative records. They come from government agencies. They come from patients using patient portals and perhaps taking questionnaires online and so on and so forth. And some of these data sets are already here. In the US, a lot of us are working on the National Cancer Database. There are 34 million patient records in that database. If you look at a relatively common cancer, such as breast cancer, you have 2 million breast cancer cases just like that. And that's obviously a lot of breast cancer cases. And you can start to look at even very rare presentations, like we published a paper on breast cancer with an unknown primary, typically where the woman presents with positive nodes in the axilla, and despite all kind of imaging, you cannot find the primary. And then, of course, what do? This is a very rare presentation, but if you have 2 million cases up front, you will find 1,500 or so of these cases out of the 2 million. And then we can start to see, okay, what happened? What is the survival? What kind of treatments did they actually receive? The Food and Drugs Administration in the US has what they call the Sentinel Database. It's a very large database. They have nearly 800 million person years of data, and these numbers are from 2020. They have 15 billion, so 15,000 million pharmacy dispensings, 14 billion unique medical encounters, lots and lots of members with at least one laboratory test result, and so on and so forth. And there are endless possibilities, of course, when you get into these large databases. And the question, of course, is if instead of starting with basic science and then working our way towards adoption of a technique in the clinic, whether we could start with population data and then analyze the data, perhaps come up with hypotheses that we could test in the laboratory or in trials, and then learn about basic science, but sort of turning this research chain upside down, going from ideas to data, and now from data to ideas. And again, I find it very difficult, and that's also what we wrote in this review paper with Ivan Vogelius back in 2020. I find it very difficult to believe that this will replace the traditional hypothesis-driven research, but I'm absolutely convinced that it will be an important supplement to that kind of research. So I think we will be doing both, and we will have to learn when we should use this kind of paradigm and when the data science paradigm is more efficient. And then I would just say a single word about data mining. When you start doing data mining in these large data sets, you often find out that there are data that are not there. And data farming is this idea that if we prospectively plan that one day we will analyze the data, then data farming means that instead of just digging in the soil, you actually plan to add outcomes or data or links to images or links to treatment plans and so on. And you do that prospectively so that when you're ready to analyze the data, you have already prepared the ground. You have already sown the seeds. And data farming, I think, is something we will all be doing more in the future. So that's really what I wanted to tell you today. I'm sure that in the next 5 to 10 years, we will be creating large curated databases with outcome data, with images, with dose matrices. With these kind of new tools, people can go back, we can all go back, and we can delineate structures that were not delineated at the point of care. And there's a lot of groups currently working on this, and we have seen the first papers where people have retrospectively gone back to a treatment plan archive. They have outlined cardiac substructures. This is a study just published recently in the Red Journal from the Netherlands. And they have then retrospectively been able to calculate those to various substructures in the heart. And this is so powerful because then obviously you will get a very large data set with individual level dosimetry that you can start to analyze. And now we can push the limits from the low-grade toxicity that we may not be so concerned about to the high-grade toxicity that we really should be concerned about. We would need to agree on an ontology so that we can compare these databases and share data across institutions. And of course, when we do modeling exercises, we should store the full model. A lot of modeling is underreported in the literature, and we should store the full model together with the data set that was used so that people in the future can go back to your data and then see how the data would fit with whatever new model they are working on. And as I just said before, the future is already here. This is happening right in front of our eyes, and this will happen even more in the next 5 to 10 years. There's a lot of opportunity. For those of you on the call who are just beginning to enter this field, the future is bright. There's so much opportunity, and there are so many opportunities to get involved. You should be aware of these, and you should be part of the people who take it forward. So the current models are far from perfect, but they are actually much better than what we used to have. And as Voltaire said, the perfect is the enemy of the good. You cannot expect to get to a perfect model just like that. And think about the alternative. If you have a single point constraint, that corresponds to a model where you have a very low risk below a given threshold and then a constant risk above that threshold. And that's pretty bad. That's much worse than actually fitting a model to your data. And if you don't even have a constraint, then you have a really bad model. You have a model that is just crazy, because then you believe that dose doesn't matter at all. And what we really have learned is that the dose of ionizing radiation is obviously what drives radiation side effects. So all models are wrong, but some are useful. George Box's famous quotation from 1987. And with those wise words, I would like to thank all of you, and thanks for your attention, and thanks for inviting me today. And as I said, I'm happy to take a few questions if time allows.
Thank you very much, Professor Benson. It was really a perfect speech for us.
Thank you.
It was very clear and very understandable, and understand in a basic way in this complex complex things in radiobiology in general. So
thank you. That's very kind of you. Thank you.
You may ask questions in the chat box, but meanwhile, I have a few questions just to let the people write. As I understand from your talk, it's a developing condition. I mean, all these efforts are maybe changed in the next years and decades.
Yeah.
Do I understand from that you are going to maybe publish a QUANTEC version 2 in the future or something like that?
Yeah, no, that's a good thought, and it is being discussed. We organized a workshop in Baltimore just before the pandemic, actually. That was back in February 2021. We had participants from Asia who couldn't travel because of coronavirus in those countries. And some of our Italian participants were lucky to get out of Italy just before they closed all kind of air travel. Yes, there is a plan to form a collaboration, an international consortium of modelers. We would like to have a repository of models that we would keep up to date, and where you could share data, and where you could have models that were live, in the sense that if you had a patient where you would like a risk estimate, you could go to that website and you could say, yes, this is a 45-year-old man with prostate cancer, and the plan is this and that, and the dose to the rectal wall or whatever is this and that. And with a little bit of luck, we hope to begin working on this. It has been a little bit under the radar because of the pandemic, but we hope to work on this seriously in the next year or so. A lot of the people who are involved in BENTZEN, of course, are also people who are interested in this QUANTEC 2, as we call it. But I think it will happen. And you're right, so much has happened since QUANTEC. If you read QUANTEC today, you would say, yeah, okay, but where is this study and where is that study? And that is healthy. That just shows, as you said, that the field is evolving, people are moving forward. We are beginning to see lots of good studies. We are seeing them also from Turkey, actually. There has been some very good normal tissue adverse event studies published at ESTRO meetings in the last few years. So definitely a lot of people are interested, and the more people who put effort into it, the more we will learn and the better we will be doing.
Okay, I see Dr. Gökhan Özyiğit, who is the chair of our society. I think he has a question.
Hi.
Actually, not a question. Hi, Professor Benson. I'm Gökhan Özyiğit from Ankara, from the capital city of Turkey. I really welcome to our radiobiology program, and also on behalf of our society, I would like to thank you for this marvelous lecture.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And also your presence in not face-to-face, but from the remote distance is a great pleasure and honor for us. I think before 20,000, yeah, you were in Izmir, one of the Östra corps.
That's true. Yes, yeah. That's true. Were you there?
Not actually.
No, it's a pleasure for me, honestly, and thanks for your kind words. I'm very happy to give the lecture today, and I was very happy to be invited. I have very good memories from Turkey, and I have known not just Beste, but also many other colleagues. I worked for Özlem Ataman, or she worked with me when she did her PhD, of course. So I feel definitely connected to the Turkish radiation oncology community.
Thank you very much. And at the beginning of this radiobiology program, I actually called radiobiology as the kitchen of radiation oncology. And
yes.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if we are giving adequate value and importance to radiobiology. You're moving from Europe to United States maybe because of that. Because radiobiology programs, there are some couple of issues. I know all those problems.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, I hear you.
Or not, I have no idea. But in Turkey, we have only one Master of Science program in Turkey, no doctorate program. We should give enough importance to radiobiology. As I told you before, it's the kitchen. We should cook our meals over there. And then we...
Yeah, I agree. No, I couldn't agree more. I really agree with you. I think radiation biology has been on the defense for quite a few years. I mean, in Britain, it has been rolled back in a big way. In the US, to some extent. In some countries, the Netherlands, Germany, maybe less so. But I think you're right. And I think if you want to, I think it has been a big problem. And I think you're right that it is also a problem who will teach the next generation then. Because if everybody get old and gray-haired, like I'm doing, then who are the teachers of the next generation and those people who come after them? And I think it is important that we put it on the agenda and that we try to train people as much as we can. If you want to have a little bit of sunshine also, because I think part of the good news, maybe if there is some good news, is that the clinical radiobiology has also grown much stronger, I think. The idea that we actually use clinical observations and people go into the clinic, they start studies, they do plan comparisons, they start giving questionnaires to patients, they do quality of life assessment, whatever. I think that has been a positive development. So the lab sciences have been under a lot of pressure, and I think that has been bad to see. And I agree with you, actually, and I think we need to find a solution to that as well. At the same time, we have seen growth in the clinical radiobiology, and a lot of the questions now In the old days, we would say, yes, there are mouse data showing so and so. Now, more and more, we can sometimes say, yes, there are actually clinical data showing that so and so. And again, I think we should walk on both legs. I think you need lab science, wet lab science as well. I think you need in silico science, modeling, calculations, all kind of stuff. And I think you need clinical research as well with a scientific kind of drive and not a purely maybe always clinical drive. Yeah.
Completely agree. And as final words, so in this context, I really appreciate your contribution to our radiobiology program. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Professor Benson, before you move to your meeting, I know you don't have time. I have one more question. Maybe after that we can let you free.
No, I'm good for another 10 minutes, actually.
Okay. If you have other questions, I will just add. Do you think that there's enough data with protons to write a QUANTEC proton version?
Ah, that's a good question. I think we are probably right at that limit. I think it is beginning to come, but I think you put your fingers right on the open wound, because there's not so much systematic data from protons yet. I know there's a group in Japan that actually has a very large set of data, and they are beginning to publish from that data set, and I think that's very positive. I also know that there's a group in Heidelberg in Germany who sits on a relatively large data set of proton data. With a little bit of luck, with the new proton centers coming online, we will start to see more outcome data. But I think you're right, we are not quite at that point yet.
The reason I'm asking this is because you probably have the same issue, the problem in the BENTZEN, because a lot of pediatric patients are being treated already with protons in many centers.
Yes, you're absolutely right. 100%, I agree. The problem there is, again, that proton therapy for children in a big way is relatively recent. And a lot of the effects that we look at in childhood cancer survivors are really late effects. They come after many years. When you hit the age range where you start to run into cardiovascular disease or malignancies and so on, you see that elevated risk in children who had radiation therapy. But by looking at these very late effects, we are forced to go back to technologies that are not dominating anymore. We are beginning to see the first childhood proton therapy late effects papers also with second malignancy. But if you look carefully at those papers, they are still very early, so the data are not super strong. There's not a lot of events yet. But I think it will come, and I think it will come in a way that we will be able to analyze it in the years to come. But you're right, there is a dilemma here. And you're also right in what you said in the introduction to your question, because a lot of these models are data hungry. They need big data sets. Huh? And that's because of all the moving parts in the data sets. The more you adjust for age at exposure, at attained age, the more you adjust for co-medication or other treatment modalities and so on, the more data you need. Each time you put a new parameter into your model, you need more data to be able to estimate the effect of that parameter. So what used to be a big data set, today we will say, oh, that's not a lot of data, we would need more, huh? And that's kind of the where we are. Huh? We always need more data. Huh? Whenever people say, how many patients will I need for this study? We say, well, more than you like, huh? Because that's always true. And I hope we can see these large collaborative networks, maybe national networks, hopefully also international networks. If large departments go together, it doesn't need necessarily to be everybody in a country, but maybe the 4 largest centers or whatever. I'm not against the smaller centers, and I think there could be educational value, of course, in having everybody involved. And sometimes small centers are more active than large centers. I understand that as well. But having said that, to get those numbers, simply to get the big volumes, it would be nice if we could collaborate. And I think we are collaborating more and more. When I started, people were often sort of protective about their data. I said, you shouldn't tell them everything you know, and so on and so forth, and you wanted to publish first and so on. I think that's much less of an issue today. I think a lot of people see the value of collaboration, and in my experience, most people will not try to run away with your data or anything like that. I think it's much more collaborative.
Okay, I think we're done. We don't have any. Sarah has a question. Last question.
Last question.
All right.
First, I really want to take. It was an excellent lecture, Professor Benson.
Thank you.
In your beginning of your lecture, you mentioned that we have a long way to walk.
Yeah.
But what's your prediction about hypertext technology? Do we really different dose constraints for that? And when will we get it?
Yeah, that's a good question also. That's a very good question. I don't think there's a simple answer. I think some constraints can probably be extrapolated. I think other constraints are not relevant anymore. I think just like what we discussed with the protons versus photons, I think the models we use, and thereby also the constraints we use, will often have to be developed for the kind of technique that we are using. This is what somebody like Professor Timmerman in the US has seen very clearly, because when he started with these SBRT treatments, a lot of people thought that he was just crazy, he was taking a big risk for his patient. He said, no, we need to use the fact that we don't know the constraints, and then we need to build up that knowledge. I know that some of the groups in Japan, they have treated carbon ion therapy the same way. Instead of saying, yeah, we need the RBE, and then we need to convert the dose, and then we need to calculate dose constraints, they say, yeah, but why don't we treat it as a completely new drug? We don't really know what it will do. And then you can do like a phase 1 trial that you would do in medical oncology. And you can say, yes, we start at a low dose, then we increase the dose, and then we increase the dose. So I think, again, you put your finger on it. I mean, some constraints I think is convertible, and at least it can give you a starting point. And then again, I hope we will be able to refine those as we go along. And the way to do that is to systematically record, follow your patient, record what you do, and see the consequence really. But I think, as I said, and I'm not trying to be overly optimistic, but I think we are in a good spot. I think there's a new generation of people coming into the field. I know I sound old now, but in a way I am old. And that new generation, they are well trained, they want to contribute, they are interested in science, and I'm very optimistic. I think we will move forward. We have moved forward in the last 20 years. I'm sure we will move even more forward in the next 20 years. And it will be fun to see that happening and hopefully be playing a small part of it.
I think we're not going to let you. We have 2 questions from the chat, if you can see. One is perhaps geriatric normal tissue effects in the clinic analysis. QUANTEC is also necessary as geriatric patients are being treated more and more. Do you agree on this? Do we need any special quantification for the elderly people?
I think that's also a good point. And I think, again, the simple answer, I'm pretty sure, is yes. I think in the geriatric scenario, again, you have so many typically comorbidities. We know certain types of medication could interfere. Just like we have a pediatric BENTZEN, we may have actually a geriatric version of QUANTEC. I agree. I think that is an issue. And with the aging of the population, 80-year-olds is the most rapidly expanding segment in the US population. And I'm sure that's true in many other populations as well. So we are seeing patients that are often more frail, often more challenged in various ways. And I'm sure we need to find ways of taking that into consideration as well. what is happening now, and I think again that is the right way forward, is that we are beginning to see trials that are specifically designed to be conducted in elderly individuals. Traditionally, a lot of medical oncology trials have excluded elderly patients. Some radiation oncology trials have been less restrictive, but most have had some kind of an age limit. But I think that will have to change.
And the next question is, shortly I can say, are we overprotective for the spinal cord dose constraints, like 50 gray, 45 gray?
Yeah, I think probably we are. That would be my take, just based on the data side of things. I think the other thing that we haven't discussed in the lecture today, maybe you will discuss it in your lecture, but you have to take some risk, huh? You have to treat the patient in front of you. You have to treat the disease in that patient with sufficient intensity that you give that patient a good chance of being cured. So a spinal cord constraint, any kind of constraint, can only be seen in relation to what is the gain by exceeding the constraint. I think often we are being sort of too concerned about our constraints, because obviously if you are just below, say, 45 gray, or if you're just above 45 gray, that may not be a huge difference in terms of risk. But if the advantage of going in with that kind of field technique and maybe exceeding the constraint, not exceeding it widely, of course, but maybe just exceeding it a little bit, if that is justified, if it will give you a much better dose distribution in your target, then I would probably say, yes, we need to find a way of making this work. Huh? And I think, again, it's important. You cannot reduce your risk to zero. I mean, if you have surgery, there's a risk. If you have a dental implant, there's a risk. Huh? There's always a risk. If you do something active, there's always a risk. And of course, in radiation oncology, we would like to keep that risk as low as possible. And I'm all for it. I think often we have not been good at doing that. But you also have to accept that there will be a risk, and we need to find the right balance. You cannot be overly conservative, because then you may be under-treating your patients. So I think that's a good question also.
Okay, I think we're done. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Excellent. I appreciate it. Thanks for your time, and thanks for having me. And I really enjoyed all the questions. They were good questions.
Thank you very much. We hope to see you in a live meeting soon.
That would be fun. I'll come if you invite me.
Sure,
Thank you.
We will do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And şimdi Türkçe'ye geçiyorum izninizle. Beste Hocam, Serra Hocam. Ve hemen hızlıca kalan süreyi kullanmak adına ekranımı da paylaşıyorum. Çok özür dilerim. Şimdi öbür taraftan açayım ben. End of. Kaç dakikada bitirmemi istersiniz Beste Hocam? Ona göre
Burası olsun sizin.
herkesin sabrınızı.
Bentzen Hoca nasıl sıra dışı bir insansa siz de hocam bizim için, dünya için öylesiniz. Lütfen istediğiniz gibi kullanın zamanı.
Şimdi mümkün olduğu kadar sizi sıkmadan Türkçe konuşmanın da rahatlığı içerisinde bir sunumun üzerinden geçeceğim. Tabii konuştuğumuz şeyler hep modellerdi. Ama bu modeller klinik deneyime ve klinik tecrübelere, daha sonra da yapılan çalışmalara dayanıyordu. Şimdi bunun gerçek hayattaki karşılığı, yani kliniğe geldik ve radyasyon hasarıyla karşılaşıyoruz. Hasar tabii ne kadar doğru bir şey bilmiyorum ama belki radyasyon yan etkisi demek lazım. Tıpkı şu anda işte CTC'de kullanıldığı gibi adverse effect, adverse event olarak da adlandırmak lazım ama gerçek hayatta bir takım şeylerle karşılaşıyoruz. Bir defa bu karşılaşmalarda kusura bakmayın sunum İngilizce, belki BENTZEN kalırsa diye İngilizce sunarım diye şey yaptım ama her halükarda ben size Türkçe anlatacağım. Şimdi neden değerlendirmemiz ve bunu kuantifiye etmemiz gerekiyor? Yani radyasyon hasarını bir defa, yani yaptığımız işin karşılığını bir defa görmemiz lazım. Yani onkolojik olarak diyoruz ki lokal kontrol oranımız %90. Peki bunu yaparken ne oranda bir yan etkiyle biz bunu gerçekleştiriyoruz? Bütün zaten radyoterapinin terapötik window, terapötik indeks dediğimiz şeyin aslında temeli bu. Yani bir tarafta sadece %90 lokal kontrol bildirdiğiniz bir makalenin kabul edilme şansı, eğer yan etkileri bildirmiyorsanız pek bir şansı yok demektir. Dolayısıyla bunu bildirmemiz gerekiyor. Kendi sonuçlarımızı da görmemiz açısından. Bu niye gerekiyor? Bir defa radyoterapinin diğer tedavilerle karşılaştırılabilmesi için gerekiyor. Yani biz cerrahiye karşı daha iyi miyiz, aynı mıyız? Eğer aynıysak yan etkilerimiz daha mı iyi acaba? Hep şunu da göz ardı etmememiz gerekiyor. Birazdan bu değerlendirmelerle ilgili klinikte kullandığımız skorlamaları konuşurken bahsedeceğiz. Aslında çok da farkında değiliz yaptığımız işin. Çünkü biz organ koruyucu bir tedavi yapıyoruz. Ama mesela bir akciğer kanserli hasta yeri geldiğinde bir akciğeri çıkartılabiliyor ve bu yan etki olarak geçmiyor. Yani bir pneumonektomi yan etki değil, ama siz bir radyasyon hasarı yaptığınızda bir akciğerde bu yan etki olarak geçiyor. O organın büyük bir kısmını, fonksiyonunu koruduğunu söylüyor. Aynı şey diğer organ koruyucu tedavilerle içinde geçerli. Yani biz aslında daha iyi bir iş yapıyoruz ama bunun da farkında olabiliyoruz. Başka ne için gerekli? Diye radyoterapi tekniklerinin, dozlarının, volümlerinin, fraksiyonasyonlarının karşılaştırılması. Biraz evvel de Bentzen'in söylediği gibi mesela ilk EMAMI yapıldığı zaman, yayınlandığı zaman, o zaman böyle en çok trendi iş hep böyle fraksiyonasyon çalışmalardı. Hiperfraksiyonemin verelim, günde 2 defa mı, akselere mi yapalım? Doz, günlük hipofraksiyoneleri yavaş yavaş kullanalım mı gibi çalışmalardı. Ama laboratuvardaki sonuçlarla klinik her zaman çok birbiriyle örtüşmedi. Dolayısıyla gerçek hayat her zaman için daha önemli. Dolayısıyla biz de bu sonuçlarımızı bildirirken mutlaka bu yan etkileri de burada göz ardı etmememiz gerekiyor. Ayrıca bir takım çalışmalar yaptığımızda da bunların birbiriyle karşılaştırılabiliyor olması lazım. Yani Amerika'da birisi bir çalışma yaptığında, Avrupa'da birisi çalışma yaptığında veya Japonya'da bunlar birbirine yan etki skorlaması açısından en azından bir eşdeğer olması gerekiyor ki birbiriyle karşılaştırılabilmesi için. Ve daha da önemlisi belki biz bunları bilip işte QUANTEC veya diğer modellemelerle olası yan etkilerini ya işte şöyle bir doz verdik, bunun karşılığında bu olabilir dediğimizde karşımıza çıkabilecek toksitelere de hazırlıklı olabilmemiz için bunlar hepsi çok önemli. Şimdi akut ve geç yan etkileri biliyorsunuz ayırt ediyoruz. Genellikle radyoterapi sonrası 3 aylık dönem içerisindeki akut ve geç yan etkilerde 90 günden sonrakiler olarak değerlendiriliyor. Aslında biz radyasyon ilk kullanılmaya başlanmasından itibaren bu yan etkilerin gözlendiğini biliyoruz. Nereden biliyoruz? Çünkü akut etkiler daha ilk uygulandığında cilt eritem dozu ile zaten verilmesi gereken doz veya verilebilecek doz hesaplanıyor. Yani biz bugün 60 Gray işte şu tümörde hastalığı kontrol eder lafına gelmeden önce bir tümörün kontrol edilebilme ihtimalinden ziyade cildin tolere edebileceği şeyleri konuşuyorduk. Yani o cilt onu tolere ediyorsa tamam, bu dozda artık kesmemiz gerekiyor ve ben hatırlıyorum 70'li yıllara kadar, 80'li yıllara kadar bile bunun çok böyle kıdemli eski hocaların bunu kullanıldığını anlattıklarını biliyorum. Yani artık bu cilt kızarmış, tamam artık bu tedaviyi kesebiliriz, bu yeterli bir dozdur diye uzun yıllar kullanılmış. Bu tabii eski cihazlar, orta voltaj cihazlarla yapılan tedaviler, ama 3 boyutlu, daha doğrusu daha derine penetre olan mega voltaj cihazlar çıktıktan sonra daha geç yan etkilerde farkında olunulmaya başlanmış. Çünkü verilen dozlar çok daha farklı dozlara çıkılabilmiş. Ve ilk aslında bu geç yan etkinin önemli olduğu şeyi 1948 yılında Londra'da Hammersmith'te yapılan hızlı nötron çalışmalarıyla ortaya çıkmış. O zaman çok böyle revaçta olan bir şey. Normal fotonlarla tedavi edemeyeceğiniz radyo dirençli tümörlerde, özellikle tükürük bezi tümörlerinde mesela uygulanmış. Akut yan etkilerin kabul edilebilir düzeyde olduğu görülmüş, ama daha sonra takip edildiğinde bu hastaların çok ciddi geç yan etkileri olduğu ortaya çıkmış ve bundan sonra aşağı yukarı 30 yıl kadar nötronlar bir kenarda kalmış, ta 70'li yıllara kadar. Dolayısıyla ilk fark edilmesi belki geç yan etkilerin bu dönem. Ve bundan sonra 70'li yıllarda da RTOG tarafından özellikle bu hızlı nötron çalışmalarında kullanılmak üzere geç morbidite skorlama kriterleri geliştirilmiş. Ve bunun da gayet güzel şeylerini James Cox'un yazılarından takip edebilirsiniz. Tabii bu Amerika'daki çalışmaların yanında bu yıllar içerisinde özellikle Avrupa'da da yürüyen çalışmalarla birlikte ya biz bunu birlikte bir toksite kriterlemesi yapalım. Common toxicity kriterlemesi şeklinde 95'li yıllarda ifade edilmeye başlanmış. Ve bu biraz evvel söylediğim geç morbidite 70'li yıllarda konuşulmaya başlandıktan sonra 85'te aslında akut radyasyon morbidite skorlama kriterleri geliştirilmiş. Bu geç şeyin üzerine. Daha sonra da NCI'nin geliştirdiği bir standart toksite kriterleri var ama en çok kullanılan RTOG-URTC toksite kriterleri hem akut hem geç toksite için 1992'de ilk olarak kullanılmaya başlamış bir meme konservasyon tedavi çalışmasında da ortak şey. Demin de bahsettiğim gibi James Cox'un bu konuda çok önemli çalışmaları var. Bu konuda hakikaten lider kişilerden birisi 1986'daki bir Astro Presidential adresinde ağırlıklı olarak fraksiyonasyondan bahsettiği bir konuşma bu. 87'de de daha sonra Kırmızı Dergi'de yayınlanmıştı bu. Ama orada bir değindiği bir konu var. Geç etkilerin önemine bahsediyor ve geç etkiler öyle hani ya işte bir yılda şu miktarda, 2 yılda şu miktarda falan gibi değil veya var yok şeklinde değil, kümülatif olarak bildirilmeli. Çünkü birçok geç etki progresif ilerliyor ve bunları daha sonra tıpkı sağ kalım eğrilerinde olduğu gibi komplikasyonsuz sağ kalım veya komplikasyon gelişene kadar geçen süre, örneğin burada görüldüğü gibi radyasyon miyeliti gelişmesi, radiation myelitis free survival gibi sağ kalım eğrileri şeklinde bildirilmesi gerektiğini özellikle söylemişler. Şimdi genel baktığımızda farklı skorlama sistemleri görebiliyoruz ama genellikle 0'dan 5'e kadar gidiyor. 0 hiçbir yan etki yok. 5 ölüm olarak geçebiliyor veya bazı skorlama sistemlerinde o organın fonksiyon kaybı veya tamamen organ kaybı şeklinde bildirilebiliyor. 1, 2, 3'te şöyle hafif semptomlar, orta dereceli semptomlar, grade 2, derece 3 şiddetli semptomlar ama derece 4'te yaşamı tehdit eden semptomlar şeklinde olabiliyor. Şimdi 1995 çok önemli. Bu özellikle yan etkileri skorlanmasıyla ilgili 92'de yılında yapılan bir LENT ve SOMA konsensus konferansı var. Yani geç etkiler, normal dokulardaki geç etkileri inceleyen bir toplantı bu. Hem Avrupa hem Amerika, RTOG ve URTC bir araya gelerek çalışma gruplarının oluşturdukları bir şey. Ve 95 yılında hem Kırmızı Dergi'de hem de Yeşil Dergi'de eş zamanlı bir sayı çıkarttılar. Burada LENT skorlama sistemi ve SOMA skorlama sistemi anlatıldı. Tabii burada bizim RTOG-URTC skorlamaya ilaveten bir takım şeylere ihtiyacımız olduğu için bunlar konuldu. Nedir bu SOMA skorlaması? İşte subjektif dediğimiz hasta tarafından ifade edilen şikayetlerin skorlanması, objektif olarak bunun değerlendirilmesi, bulgularla birlikte hasta üzerinde doktorun tespit ettiği bulgularla management dediğimizde SOMA'nın M'si, burada buna karşı yapılan işlemler, örneğin bir IV medikasyon yapıldıysa bu derece 4'e kadar çıkabiliyor bir mesela nöbet durumunda. Ve analitik değerlendirme, daha ileri tetkiklerle bunun değerlendirilmesi ve bunların her time point, her zamanda da bildirilmesi. Örneğin bir şikayet veya bulgu derece 1 başlayabilir ama bu derece 2'ye geçtiğinde ayrı bir skorlama yapılabilir. Yani birçok şeyi göz önünde bulundurılan çok detaylı bir çalışmaydı bu. O dönemde aynı sayıda yayınlanan bu yazıda da James Cox'un şeyinde aynı zamanda bu URTC-RTOG skorlaması da bildirildi. Bu yıllarca kullanılmış olan RTOG-URTC skorlaması. Burada gördüğünüz gibi cilt, mukoz membranlar, göz, kulak gibi çok basit organ tanımları var ve her birinin işte olabilecek radyoterapiye bağlı yan etkileri bildiriliyordu. Bunlar daha basit, daha nispeten kullanılabilir skorlama sistemleriydi. Burada görüyorsunuz. erken ve geç genetik skorları. Bundan sonraki de şu 2 sayfada, 2 slaytta da geç genetikler. Bütün yani radyoterapi süresince sanki olabilecek genetikler bu kadar sınırlı ama böyle değil. Dolayısıyla o lent ve somanın hakikaten çok işe yarayabileceği ve bunun da prospektif olarak birçok çalışmada kullanılması önerildi, tavsiye edildi. Ama aynı derginin, mesela Kırmızı Dergi'de makalelere baktığınızda ya bunun tamam güzel ama acaba biz bunu gerçekleştirebilir miyiz? Bunun yaygın kullanımını yapabilir miyiz diye eleştiren yazılar bile vardı. Şöyle bir tarihçeye yine üzerinden geçersek bugüne nasıl geldik? Aslında bu 95 bizim bu RTOG, EORTC bir araya gelip oluşturduğu bu toksite kriterlerine common toksite kriterleri dendi. Tabii burada onkolojik tedavilerde yan etkiyi biz radyasyon onkologları olarak bildirmeye çok yıllar önce başladık ve bunu sistematik hale gelmiş hali aslında 95 milat diyebiliriz. Ama o dönemlerde daha şeyin adı yok. Yani mesela kemoterapi toksitesi veya cerrahi toksitesinin değerlendirilmesi. Bunlar yani bizim çok daha arkamızdan geliyorlar. Dolayısıyla bu ilk common toxicity kriterlerinin geliştirilmesi radyasyon onkologları tarafından gerçekleştirildi. Erken ve geç genetik toksiteler olarak ayrılmıştı. Kemoterapi toksitelerinin bu CTC'ye eklenmesi versiyon 2 ile 99 yılında gerçekleştirildi. Daha sonra versiyon 3'te bu toksitenin adı adverse event olarak değiştirildi. Neden? Çünkü bazen tedavi dışı sebeplerle olan bir takım rahatsızlıklar da bulunabiliyor. Bu hastaların takibinde kayda geçmesi gerekebiliyor. Onun için adverse event olarak değiştirildi ve çalışmalarda da bu şekilde kullanıldı. Daha sonra 4. versiyonda biraz daha detaylandırıldı. Biraz daha böyle subjektif kalan şeyler, muğlak olan şeyler netleştirildi ve en son şu anda 2017 versiyon 5 kullanılıyor. Bunda da MET-DRA denilen bir terminoloji harmonizasyonu çalışması var. Bunun amacı şu, mesela İngiltere'de tedavi edilen bir hastayla, İngilizce konuşulan bir ülkede hastanın tedavisinin, Japonya'da yapılan bir çalışmada aynı harmonizasyon içinde olması lazım. Yani gruplar arasında, ülkeler arasında dil farklılığı olmasın diye göz ardı edilmiş göz ardı edilmemesi gereken bir şey. Terminolojinin birliğinin sağlanabilmesi ve bu da sağlandıktan sonra şu anda 5. versiyonu kullanılmakta. Tabii skorlama sistemlerinin de bir takım sıkıntılar var. Yok değil. Çok detaylı olunca kullanım şeyi tabii ki zorlaşabiliyor, yaygınlığı zor olabiliyor. Ama yine de mesela baktığımızda 2 hasta aynı şikayetle gelebiliyor. Nefes darlığı ve öksürükle gelebiliyor. Bir tanesi hafif bir grade 2 pulmoner toksite olarak adlandırılırken diğeri o skorlama sistemine baktığınızda ilaç verdiğiniz için derece 1 olarak da adlandırılabiliyor. Dolayısıyla bu hastalarda yani yapılan tedavilerin zamanı ve yapılan tedaviye bağlı olarak değişebileceği söz konusu. Bu da yine kafalarda soru işareti. Ben senin yine konuşmada bahsettiği benim hani daha sonra bahsedebileceğim şey, yani mesela beyin radyasyon nekrozu. Bizim eski şeylerimizde hep böyle var yok. Bakıyorsunuz dataya bütün lokal kontrol bilgisi var. Ondan sonra radyasyon nekrozu 30 hastanın 2'sinde gelişti, 3'ünde gelişti, 5'inde gelişti gibi rakamlar var. Yani bu aslında çok da bir kafada bir şey oluşturmuyor. Örneğin bu bir hasta nazofarenks kanserine tedavi olmuş ve bilateral temporal lob nekrozu gelişmiş ve yaygın ödemi olan bir hasta. Bu da bir radyasyon nekrozu. Bu tek fraksiyon SRS uygulanmış bir hasta. Ondan sonra hafif bir ödemi var. Daha ya asemptomatik ya çok az semptomu var. Bu da radyasyon nekrozu ve bunun seyri çok farklı olabiliyor. Bu da 3 yıldır radyasyon nekrozuyla yaşayan benim bildiğim kendi hastam aldığı tedavilerle işte antianjiyojenik tedavilerle neredeyse günlük hayatını hiçbir şekilde etkilemeyen bu kadar büyük bir radyasyon nekrozu var. Biz bunları klinik, radyolojik nasıl skorlayacağız? Hakikaten bir takım soru işaretleri var. QUANTEC bahsedildi. Pediatrik grupta mesela yakın zamanda Astro'da sunulan bu hasta grubunda nörokognitif ve beyin radyasyon nekrozunu Anita Mahaya'nın sunumundan ben burada koydum. Biliyorsunuz burada mesela CTC 5.0'a baktığımızda nasıl skorluyor? İşte grade 1 asemptomatik, hiçbir gelişim gerekmiyor. Grade 2 steroid gerekiyor. 3 şiddetli semptomları var, girişim gerekiyor artık neyse, yani cerrahi olabilir veya başka. 4 yaşam tehdit eden, 5 ölüm. Eski şeye bakıyorsunuz, RTOG EOR skorlamasını 3'e kadar ayırmış. Bundan sonrası yok. Yani eski dataları mesela bununla karşılaştırmanız mümkün değil. Yani bir harmonizasyon gerekiyor veya bunları eşdeğerleştirmeniz gerekiyor. Ve en kötüsü bunlar birçok şeyde yayına bakıyorsunuz bildirilmiyor bile. Yani radyasyon nekrozu var yok şeklinde geçiyor. Maya'nın da konuşmasında en büyük sıkıntılardan birisi, kendileri bu datayı oluştururken, QUANTEC datasını oluştururken sadece belki radyolojik bilgiler var. Çoğu hastada üniform olarak bildirilmemişler bu skorlamalar. Farklı zamanlarda bildirilmemiş. Demin bahsettiğim gibi mesela Grade 1 daha sonra Grade 2'ye progres olmuş. Grade 3'e çıkmış. Hiç onlardan bahsedilmiyor. Ve ilk başlangıç skorları, mesela nörokognitif fonksiyonları, bunların baştan nasıldı bu çocukların, onlar da çok bilinmiyor. Hızlıca CTC 5'i şöyle bir göstereyim. 2017 web sayfasından rahatlıkla indirebilirsiniz. Burada derece 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 biraz evvel gösterdiğim gibi burada günlük yaşamı ne kadar etkiliyle ilgili, günlük yaşantıda aktivitesini ne kadar etkilediğiyle ilgili. Mesela eğer kendi yemeğini hazırlayabiliyorsa, markete gidip alışveriş yapabiliyorsa, o zaman bu grade 2. Bunu etkiliyorsa, daha doğrusu grade 2. Yani yapabiliyorsa grade 1, yapamıyorsa grade 2. 3'e geliyorsunuz, sadece kendi hazırladığı, başkasının hazırladığı yemeği yiyor, giyinebiliyor, edebiliyor. Hani neredeyse Türk erkek popülasyonunun %90'ını falan oluşturuyor. Böyle bir grupsa o zaman derece 3 olarak adlandırılabiliyor. Yani diyeceğim o ki burada şiddet yine sübjektif bir şey. Çoğu kez hekimin değerlendirilmesiyle yapılan bir şey. Farklı bölgelere göre çok sayıda item var, farklı bölgeler, her birinin ayrı ayrı. Mesela oral mukozit için burada değerlendirme, bulantı, bu gastrointestinal bozukluklarla ilgili hem radyoterapi hem kemoterapi toksitelerinde bunu kullanabilirsiniz. Ama bakıyorsunuz mesela sadece bunun sınırı değil. Bizim çok sık karşılaştığımız oral mukozit. Yani problemleri anlatmaya çalışıyorum. Dünya Sağlık Örgütü'nün oral toksite skalasına bakıyorsunuz. Eritema, ülser, ondan sonra yutma fonksiyonunun durumuna bakılıyor. Ondan sonra ve ülser mesela her şeyde gözüküyor. Ama şeye bakıyorsunuz, RTOG'de ülser en sonda. Yani derece 4 dediğimizde bunun ne olduğu RTOG skorlamasına göre olduğunu bilmemiz gerekiyor. Eğer Dünya Sağlık Örgütü'ne bakarsanız bu derece 2'de yer alıyor. Aynı şey burada CTC'de farklı mesela işte PEK kullanımı var mı yok mu, ağrı var mı yok mu, ağrılı ülser varsa mesela hala grade 1'de geçiyor. Dolayısıyla yani bir homojenizasyon sağlamak hakikaten çok zor. Yıllar içerisinde farklı skorlamalar kullanılmış ama bir şey yapıyorsak baştan bunu belirlememiz lazım. Mesela bir klinik hep bunu kullansın veya bir çalışma yapıyorsak baştan sona bu kullanılsın diye bir skorlama yapmak gerekiyor. Tabii biraz evvel söyledim, bu klinisyenler tarafından değerlendirilen bir şey yapıyor, skorlanıyor. Ama bunun bir de yeni versiyonu Pro CTCA var. Bunda Patient Reported Outcomes, yani hasta kendisi bunları değerlendiriyor. Örneğin bulantı varsa ne kadar sıklıkla bulantısı olduğunu kendisi belirtiyor. Ağrısı varsa şiddetini kendisi belirtiyor. Hasta tarafından doldurulan 124 tane başlık var. Bunu elektronik ortamda doldurabiliyor. Güzel yanı. Yani siz de buradan girip hastaya işte şu şeyleri doldurur musunuz diye belli aralıklarla, mesela haftada bir doldurmasını söylediğinizde hasta kendi başına bunları girip aplikasyonları da var. Cep telefonundan da doldurabiliyor ve biraz evvel yine Sayın Bentzen'in de söylediği gibi muhteşem bir big data oluşabiliyor bunlarla birlikte. Bir de tabii bu skorlamayı yaparken bir başka şekilde de biz hastaların acaba bu yan etkileri ne yapıyoruz, günlük hayatlarına ne kadar etkiliyoruz diye yapılan işlerden birisi de yaşam kalitesi anketleri. Bunlar da çok önemli. Bazen bizim o sorgulayamadığımız veya hastadan alamadığımız yan etkiyi bu yaşam kalitesi skorlama anketlerinden alabiliyoruz. Amerika'da kullanılan versiyon ağırlıklı olarak FACT iken burada mesela işte genel bir anket, 27 soruluk bir anket şeyi var. 38 genel versiyonu var. Ve esas belki her kanser için spesifik ve çok detaylı mesela pediatrik olarak yapılan var. Hani bir çalışma yapacak olduğunuzda aklınızda olsun ya böyle ben bir test çalışması yapacağım. Bunu işte neyle desteklesem acaba daha kaliteli bir çalışma olur dediğinizde ulaşabileceğiniz şeylerden birisi FACT. Diğeri de UARTS'ın yaşam kalitesi anketleri. Bunda da yeni bir QLQ-C30 dediğimiz bu ana questionnaire var. Onun dışında da bölgelere özel her bir kanser bölgesi için ayrı ayrı modüller var. Bunları da eklediğinizde o çalışmanın içerisinde hastaların yaşam kalitesi anketlerinde eklediğinizde hakikaten kaliteli bir veriye ulaşabiliyorsunuz. Evet, benim anlatacaklarım bu. Yine bir Hipokrat lafıyla devam edelim. Önce zarar vermeyelim bu kadar lafın üstüne. Ama zarar vermemiz gerekiyorsa da hani bu Antakya'daki mozaikteki gibi yan gelip yatmayalım. Bir zahmet onları grade'leyelim ve raporlayalım diyorum ve teşekkür ediyorum. Beste Hocam istersen sen moderatör ol. Soru varsa alayım. Sesini kapalı.
Şimdi geliyor mu? Geliyor.
Evet.
Fevkalade bir sunumdu hocam. Çok güzel özetlediniz. Çok güzel mesajlarınızı da verdiniz. Yani dosyalara muayene ettikleri zaman arkadaşlarımız hem derecelendirecekler hem de parantez içinde neye göre derecelendirdiklerini de yazacaklar. Hangi şeye göre, kriteri kullandıklarına göre. Sizin günlük rutininizde kullandığınız hangisi hocam? CTC mi? Versiyon 5'i mi kullanıyorsunuz? Nasıl yapıyorsunuz?
Şimdi şöyle, günlük pratikte bunları kullanmak çok zor. Çoğu kez insanlar bunları sadece bir klinik çalışmaya katıldıklarında önüne koyuyor. Her seferinde ya bu grade 1 mi 2 mi? Ya bir defa şu var, yani artık dünyada birliğe gidilmiş durumda. Bizim artık RTOG, URTC skorlamasını herhalde kullanmamamız gerekiyor. CTC versiyon 5 artık universal hale gelmiş durumda. Dolayısıyla biz de bunu rutin hale getirmemiz lazım. Çok sayıda item var. Yani bir sürü semptom var, bulgu var, bilmem ne var. Ama gerçekten de yoğun poliklinik içerisine bunun yerleştirilmesi çok zor. Ama şu mümkün bence. Yani alışkanlık elimizin altında bulunması, her ne kadar prospektif çalışma yürütmüyor olsak bile kendi retrospektif datamızı kullanırken geriye dönüp ya bu CTC'ye göre bu grade 3 bir işte oral mukozitmiş bu akut reaksiyon. Bunu söyleyebileceğimiz en azından datayı işlememiz lazım. Yani hastanın ağzında işte konfleyen mukozit görüldü. Bu ifade çok önemli. Veya işte IV hidrasyon yapıldı. Yani biz günlükte yaptığımız işleri yazmıyoruz. En büyük defektimiz o. Yani o anda skorlamamız şart değil. Ama o anda yaptığımız işi kaydettiğimizde daha sonra geriye dönüp bunu skorlama şansımız olabiliyor. Benim söyleyeceğim bu ama Serra, Beste siz günlük pratiğinizi isterseniz söylerseniz belki daha yardımcı olabilir.
Gerçekten çok teşekkür ediyoruz Ufuk Hocam. Harika bir konuşmaydı. Her zaman yani hiç tartışılır. Yani ben de sizin dediğinize çok katılıyorum. Hani hiçbirimiz poliklinikte o yoğun akışın içinde böyle hani RTOC'ye göre şöyleydi, common toxicity kriteryaya göre şöyleydi diye sınıflamıyoruz ama yani CTC'leri kullanmak en akılcısı. Hani RTOC biraz da artık çok yeterli bir skorlama sistemi değil bizim için. Bir de kombine tedavileri de beraber yaptığımız için hani yetersiz kaldığını düşünüyorum ben onun pek çok alanda. Biz de hani geriye dönük değerlendirmelerde yani olan her şeyi oraya yazmaya çalışıyoruz ama tabii çoklu hekimin olduğu bizim gibi büyük kliniklerde hani değil mi dosya pek çok kişinin elinden de geçiyor. Hani o ortak dile oturtmak da çok kolay bir şey değil. Mümkün olduğu kadar gördüğümüz her şeyi yazmalıyız. Bunları da report etmeliyiz. Çünkü QUANTEC'e başka türlü katkı sağlayamayız. Bizim gibi ülkelerden çıkabilecek en iyi yayınlar aslında yan etkilerimizi dokümante ettiğimiz yayınlar. Yani daha sonra site edilme olasılıkları yüksek. Bence hani bu kursun asistan arkadaşlara yönelik olduğunu da düşünürsek lütfen hani her şeyi rapor edin. Gördüğünüz her şeyi kaydedin. ve bunları bir şekilde değerlendirin. Çünkü bunlardan çok kaliteli ve o big data'ya da temel sağlayacak yayınlar çıkacak aslında. Bunları kendi gözlemlerimizle paylaşacağız. Ben bir soru sorabilir miyim size? Bilmiyorum sizin sorunuza cevap oldu mu ama bu patient hastanın kullandığı skorlama sistemlerini kullanıyor musunuz? Yani mesela o tip yani o URT'si, hayat kalitesi skorları yani hepimiz yaptık da hani onları değerlendirmek de çok iyi oluyor. O yani çok kolay olmuyor diye düşünüyorum ben. Sizin görüşünüz ne bu konuda?
Yani,
ya da PEC'leri, QFEX'leri kullandınız mı?
Tabii. Ya ERC, QRQ, C30 ve işte Brain modülünü yoğun bir şekilde kullandık. Özellikle ERC 22952 ve sonraki şeylerde. Onda şöyle bir şey oluyor. Yani bir defa Türkçe çevirileri valide edilmiş ama hala bizim toplum tarafından algılanması biraz zor olabiliyor. Bazen ben bile o çeviride ya burada hakikaten aslında ne demek istiyor falan gibisinden şüpheye düştüğüm oluyor. Yani şeyde de aynı şekilde üriner semptomlarla ilgili olan modülde de aynı şey geçerliydi. Ya benim kendi şeyimde birazcık böyle bir farklı kültürün hazırlamış olduğu için belki bir farklı bir şey var. Çok tabii bu zor bir iş. Yani her bir modülün sorusunun değerlendirilmesi, genel modülün değerlendirilmesi, hani o kısmı da apayrı bir zorluğu var. Zaten mutlaka bu konuda onların önerdiği guideline şeklinde, guideline'ları var. Nasıl bunu skorlayacaksınız? Peki hani her bir şeyin grubu var. İşte mesela diyelim ki işte nörokognitif fonksiyonlarla ilgili olan bir soru grubu var. Bunun puanlaması, işte semptomlarla ilgili mesela artmışsa onlar genel bir yaşam kalitesi skoru. Bunların hepsinin ayrı ayrı anlamı var. Üzerinde iyi çalışmak gerekiyor. Bir de mutlaka bir istatistik desteği almak gerekiyor bunları bildirirken. Ama hasta tarafında şöyle bir şey de yaşıyoruz. Yani zaman ayırdığınız süre ne kadarsa ona göre de çok değişiyor. Yani hızlı bir şekilde yaptırdığınızda hasta hızlı geçiyor. Siz eşlik ettiğinizde, siz okuduğunuzda, yazdırdığınızda farklı olabiliyor. O kendisi doldurduğunda farklı olabiliyor. Dolayısıyla hani çok da böyle her zaman güvenilir olmayabiliyor. Özellikle biz bunu ben şeyde hatırlıyorum. Prostat çalışmasında, SPRT çalışmasında ya bir soruya bakıyorsun işte bu ereksiyonla ilgili olan soruya verdiği cevapla öbür tarafta bunun işte psikoseksüel hayatıyla ilgili verdiği cevap birbiriyle tamamen ters. Çünkü hasta anlamamış o soruyu veya biz onu anlatamamışız. Yani o kültür farklılığı birazcık etkiliyor bunların gerçekten doğruluğunu.
Tabii yani entelektüel şeyi geçiştiriyor gibi geliyor bana hastalar. Biraz hani siz de öyle hissediyor musunuz? Hani böyle hani çala kalem hani yapayım bitsin gibi hani o gönüllülük şeyi çok onu sağlamak çok kolay olmuyor gibi geliyor bana.
Zaman ayırmak gerekiyor. Yani bununla ilgili ilgilenecek birisinin olması gerekiyor.
Aynen,
Ya bunu
aynen.
çalışma bazında bu işi yapacaksa bunu bir anket doldurmaya yeri geldiğinde yarım saat ayırması gerekiyor. Yani önden anketi bir anlatması gerekiyor. Nelere dikkat edeceğini, yeri geldiğinde soru sormasını, eğer ama herhangi bir fonksiyonda eksikliği yoksa hastanın kendisinin doldurmasını. Çünkü bir takım sorular oluyor. Yani mesela bir erkek hasta, bir kadın anket yapan kişi karşısında çekinerek bir takım şeyleri farklı da doldurabiliyor veya cevap verebiliyor. Serra kesildi. Serra'yı bloke ettik.
Ben küçük bir şey söyleyebilir miyim hocam? Bu anketler aslında yaşam kalitesi anketlerinin aslında hastanın kendisi tarafından doldurulması gerekiyor değil mi? Yani hani bizim onu okumamız gibi değil de ya da böyle gerçekten hani ona bir zaman ayırıp bir köşede oturacak, sakin bir şekilde orada şey yapacak. Hani okuma yazması da olacak, gözlüğü de takılı olacak gözünden, ne bileyim sakin ve zamanı olacak bir yerde. Yani o farklı bir şey yapabilir. Yani gerçekten aslında bunun bu şekilde yapılması gerektiğini yani arkadaşlarımız için de söylersek, yaşam kalitesi çalışacaklarsa, tez yapacaklarsa bununla ilgili aslında doğrusu bu. Bunu belirtmek istedim. Bir de hani derecelendirme ile ilgili ben de hani küçük bir şey söylemek istiyorum. Eskiden beri böyle o CTC'nin 3. versiyonundan beri aslında hani ilk uzmanlığımızın zamanlarından beri bir şekilde benim böyle baktığım hasta grubunda kabaca o graklamalar aklımda kalmış. Yani her seferinde açıp bakmıyorum ama ben poliklinik için kendime böyle bir fotokopi dosya hazırlamıştım. Dediğiniz çok doğru. Yani her seferinde açıp ona bakmak hele yoğun bir poliklinikte mümkün değil ama kabaca kafamda böyle oturmuş bir CTC graklaması var. Bugün yaptığım ya da uzun zamandır kendi poliklinik rutinimde yaptığım şey mutlaka derecesini o kafamdaki şeye göre yazmak. Yani tarif etmek tabii dediğiniz çok daha güvenilir. O tarifi yapmak daha güzel aslında. Ama o gradı bir şekilde oraya yazıyorum. Yani 1, 2 hepimizin böyle o klinik tecrübesinde de alıştığı bir şey var. Onu oraya yazmanın arkadaşlarımız için değerli olduğunu ya da dediğiniz gibi tarifi yapması, ona bakması, o yan etkiyi sadece yan etki deyip geçmemesi, görmesi çok çok önemli. Yani bu dersi koymamızın sebebi de bu aslında. Buradaki farkındalığı arttırmak. Bir de ben bir şey sormak istiyorum. Bu ProCTC'nin web sayfasına baktığımız zaman test edildiği diller için işte basit Çince, İngilizce ve İtalyanca diyor olarak. Acaba hani bunu hasta yapacağı için bunun Türkçesi ile ilgili bir çalışma yapılabilir mi? Bilmiyorum. Sadece sordum yine.
Ben de bildiğim kadarıyla görmedim ama yapılabilir. Çünkü daha evvel biliyorsunuz bir ERC'nin birkaç tane validasyon çalışması Türkiye'de yapıldı. Biz de birkaç tanesinde birlikte çeviri, translation ve validation 2 ayrı şey var onun bir de. Hani çeviri kısmını da mesela onun da bir yöntemi var. Onu eğer yoksa mesela böyle bir şeyin çeviri işini üstleniyorsunuz. Bir sürü kişiye bunu işte native speaker olanla işte bilmem şey olan native English speaker, native Turkish speaker 2 ayrı gruba şey yapıyorsunuz. Bunlar yapılabilecek işler. Yani hakikaten yapılabilecek bir sürü şey var. Bu da elektronik ortama aktarılıp mesela hastalar tarafından cep telefonuyla kendi Crush oynayacakları yere sizin anketinizi veya işte sorularınızı cevaplandırabilirler yani.
Onu tabii yapmaları
Beklerken.
için herkes tabii yani az çok everything little English biliyor, İngilizce biliyor olabilir ama yani hani kendisindeki bir şikayeti ifade etmek için.
Yok ben Türkçe'ye çevrilmeli diyorum yani zaten.
Evet,
yani çevirdikten sonra.
Evet yani herhalde öyle olursa hastaların da hoşuna gidebilir diye düşündüm de ben hem yani daha da işimizi de belki kolaylaştırabilir bir yandan da biz de hani gördüğümüz için o yan etkileri göreceğimiz
Yani
için.
genç arkadaşlara buradan çok mesaj çıkıyor. Buradan çok ekmek çıkar. Çalışırsanız, araştırırsanız kendinize, kariyerinize etki edecek çok sayıda şey bulabilirsiniz.
Evet. Soru yoksa aslında bugünü kapatabiliriz. Fevkalade bir gündü. Yani hani Benson benim de hocam biliyorsunuz Grey kanserden tez hocam aynı zamanda. Kendisi fevkalade önemli bir insan. Radyasyon onkolojisi camiasında inovatif bir insan. Yani yeniliklerin şeyi olan yenilikler getiren bir insan. Değerli CV'siyle. Bunu yani Ufuk hocamızın da sunumu fevkaladeydi. Ben çok faydalandım yine hatırladım. Çok çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Ufuk hocam siz bitirin. Haftaya şey yapmadan önce. Yani
çok teşekkürler Ufuk hocam. Ben de tekrar teşekkür edeyim.
Evet, ben de son zaman iyi akşamlar diyeyim herkese. 10. haftaya herkesi bekleriz. Görüşmek üzere. İyi akşamlar diliyoruz.
İyi akşamlar. Sağ olun.
Unutulmaz akşamlardan biri oldu.
Öyle.